Hello there, thank you for checking out this video. This is a 6-part series on the origins of ancient Rome, on Rome before it was Rome. I'm Professor Colin Elliott. I am a historian, history professor at Indiana University. I'm the author of a few books on the Roman Empire. I'm also the host of the Pax Romana podcast, and I urge you to go ahead and check out that podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else that you get podcasts. So what we're going to do with this video series is, like I said, look at Rome before it was Rome. We're going to go into the deepest, darkest, most mythical in some cases history of Rome, the city. We're going to start out actually with the setting of Rome, which was Italy, the mother of all lands, at least according to Pliny the Elder. And we'll talk about Pliny in just a moment. We're going to be talking about how the landscape, the geography, the climate, and the development of technology set the stage for 4 key components of civilization in Italy. That is agriculture, urbanization, defense, and trade. Then we're going to get to lecture number 2, which actually zooms in on the cities of Italy. Rome is just one of many what are called city-states in Italy. I want to talk about what that form of government looks like. It's really important in the ancient world, not just in Greece, but actually in Italy as well. Thirdly, we're going to look at the founding of Rome itself. I want to start out with the mythical story of Rome's founding and the legend of Romulus and Remus, the 2 brothers united to take over Rome and found it, but ultimately divided by bitterness and also a little bit of confusion about what exactly the gods were trying to tell them to do. So we'll look at that story in part 3. Part 4 continues the story after Romulus and Remus with Rome's early kings. Rome was ruled by monarchs, we know that for sure, but we don't know very much about the real kings that ruled Rome. Instead, we have these fabulous tales of mythological characters who embody some of the best and the worst elements of Roman culture. So we will talk about those stories and maybe also what the Romans had hoped to learn from them. We will then turn to a mysterious and enigmatic group called the Etruscans. The Etruscans dominated the northern and central parts of Italy when Rome was being founded. Etruscan kings actually ruled Rome at one point. But probably more important than the Etruscan kings was Etruscan culture. Again, it's mysterious. Etruscan culture vanishes by around the 1st century BC, and even its written records are still mostly indecipherable to modern historians. But the influence of Etruscan culture on Rome before it was Rome, or at least when it was becoming Rome, is difficult to overstate. Etruscan culture influenced Rome's military, Rome's religion, and maybe even Rome's economy as well. So we will talk about that. Finally, we reach the climax of Rome's origin story, the origin of the Roman Republic. Rome is ruled by evil, wicked Etruscan kings, and the nobility have enough. They decide to cast off the yoke of the Etruscan kings, and indeed all kings, once and for all, and found the Roman Republic, an experiment in government under law and liberty to some extent that will last almost 5 centuries. The Roman Republic is a marvel of a system. And probably even more than the Roman Empire, Rome is known for its republic. And the narrative in this 6-part video series gets us up to the very beginnings of the Roman Republic. I hope that you enjoy this. Let's go ahead and get started. This is part 1, Italy, the mother of all lands. All right, I'd like to begin with Pliny the Elder. Now, Pliny the Elder does not live in the time that we're going to study. He lives much later, during the height of the Roman Empire, during the period known as the Pax Romana. At this point, Rome dominates the Mediterranean. We're talking about the late 1st century AD. In fact, Pliny is famous for two things. One, dying during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the eruption that buried Pompeii under a heap of volcanic ash. Pliny the Elder actually died in that eruption. But before he died, Pliny wrote the Natural History, which is the other thing that made him famous. The Natural History was an encyclopedic collection of facts and stories about the natural world. Metals, woods, plants, animals. It also included some notes about cultures, and within those notes is a pretty impressive view of Italy, the place where Pliny himself was from, and indeed from where the Roman Empire originated. And that is really Pliny's argument, that Italy is so great because it gave birth to Rome, and in giving birth to Rome, it gave birth to a civilizing force that brought peace and prosperity to the known world. So here is what Pliny says in the Natural History. Italy is the nursling and the mother of all other lands. Everywhere else benefits from Italy. And this is because not only is Italy sort of naturally and ecologically and climatologically prosperous, but it was from the very beginning chosen by the providence of the gods, which they ordained from the beginning to make their own glory even greater. So the gods themselves bless Italy because it benefits them. In blessing Italy, they create the Roman Empire, which in turn brings civilized worship of the gods to everywhere else. Rome will unite scattered empires. Now, of course, by unite here, the Romans mean they conquered them to make manners gentle, right? This is a form of civilization. The Romans bring about peace and stability and order in the midst of a chaotic world, at least according to them. They also unite the world under one language. So to draw together in converse by community of language, the jarring and uncouth tongues of so many nations. The Romans bring Latin to the world and give mankind civilization. And then Pliny says, and in a word, to become throughout the world the single fatherland of all the races. So that is a pretty high view of Italy, but what I hope you can see is it is also partly propaganda for the glory of the Roman Empire more broadly. So I want to turn now to what makes Italy so important. And as I do this, again, we're going to be looking at the deepest history of Italy. So before Rome is a city, before anywhere, before any place is a city in Rome. And I want you to listen for 4 key markers of civilization. In other words, how do the things that I'm saying about the land and the sea and the rivers and the coasts and all of that, how do they affect 4 particular things that are pretty important for civilization to thrive? 1, agriculture, right? To what extent is Italy conducive to the development of agriculture? 2, cities. To what extent does the geography, climate, etc. of Italy promote the gathering of numerous peoples all in one place, the generation of a surplus which would support people who do not need to work on a farm full time? What about defense, right? This is also crucial for civilization, a bit of breathing room so that they can actually engage in building wealth and productivity instead of having to funnel all of their surplus resources into weapons, invasion, and so on and so forth. So listen for the markers of defense. And then finally, trade. Listen to the ways in which Italy and its various features are especially conducive to trade. All right, so those are our 4 parts. Let's go ahead and get talking about Italy. So many of you have probably been to Italy. You may even be from Italy originally. And indeed, some of my viewers are living in Italy right now. And thank you very much for watching this video. You know what Italy's like. But for those of you that are less familiar with Italy, there's much that was the same about it 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, as is the case today. First of all, Italy is a peninsula, so it is surrounded on 3 sides by sea. That sea is not particularly violent or inhospitable. It is sometimes in the winter, but for the most part, the Mediterranean is conducive to trade and travel. Even smaller boats can navigate the Mediterranean with some ease, and that will be important. So it is an accessible peninsula by means of ship. At the same time, by land, its 4th side over here is bordered in the north by the Alps. The Alps were absolutely crucial for the development of civilization in Italy because the Alps provided a defensive barrier that was very difficult to overcome. In the winter, it was virtually impassable, certainly by any kind of large armies. There's a few exceptions to that in history. We may talk about those in the future. But certainly in Italy's early history, the Alps gave the civilizations in Italy some breathing room so that they could develop and grow. Now, the Alps are not impenetrable. There are passes that one can use to get across them, especially in summer months, warm weather months. Actually, it's pretty easy to get through them in those times. Somebody on foot with just a few days of rations could make it through the Alps. So it's not an impenetrable barrier, but it does provide a natural defense against land invasions coming from the north, especially like mass invasions. So that is very beneficial for the budding civilizations in Italy. Just to the south of the Alps is the Po Valley, which is a river valley. It's a floodplain. In fact, it's one of the flattest places in Italy. And because of that river that moves through this entire part of the plain, the Po or the Padus River, this is an especially fertile valley, excellent for growing crops and for feeding livestock. In fact, the Po Valley is really the most fertile region of Italy. And then if we turn further south from the Po Valley, we get to the Apennine Mountains, which run along the peninsula almost like a backbone. Now, the Apennines are nowhere near as rugged as the Alps. They are more hospitable. So there are nomadic peoples that could easily settle in the Apennine Mountains and live there year-round. Now, the Apennines are not particularly good for growing crops, but it was possible to take other people's crops and then flee back into the mountains. And this is exactly what happened. These hill peoples would live up in the Apennines, and they would then raid settlements in the Po Valley or down here into Etruria and Latium. And by the way, although not as fertile as the Po Valley, Etruria and Latium in central West Italy are also fairly fertile regions. There are several rivers in this area that go into the ocean, including the Tiber, which is where Rome is. Those rivers enabled access to trade. They allowed ships and even small boats to move from the sea up into the hinterlands and to engage in trade. So that's a prosperous area as well. And if you could live in the Apennine Mountains, you kind of had your choice of which direction you wanted to go if you wanted to go ahead and raid and steal some people's resources. So that gets us mostly through the north of Italy. What about the south? Now, the south is warmer. The winters are not particularly harsh. Now, it's not that the winters in the north are super harsh. It's just that they are more obvious. In the south, however, winter is very mild, and it's drier in the south as well. You can actually see this, right? If you look at the satellite image of Italy on the right side of your screen, if you look at the heel of the boot, it's just this browner color, and that's in part reflecting the fact that this is a drier region. The western part of Italy tends to be a little bit wetter and moister because of those Apennine Mountains, and then it's drier in the east. But in the south, you have this really important bay, the Bay of Naples, this inlet, an almost natural harbor in the region known as Campania. And if you are a seafaring, maritime trading peoples, this is a great spot to build some coastal cities. And indeed, that's exactly what happens. All along the coast of Italy, we will see colonies set up that are maritime trading colonies. After all, if we think about Italy in the broader Mediterranean, Italy kind of bisects the two halves of the Mediterranean, the western half and the eastern half, in order to engage in long-distance trade, especially because most of those vessels that are doing that are small. They need to stay near the coastline. Those vessels would often need to go right here through the Straits of Messina and hug along the coast of Italy, or in some cases, the coast of Sicily, depending on where they're going. So this region in particular is especially advantageous for maritime trade. So Italy really has it all. They have agriculture in the Po Valley. They have agriculture in Etruria and Latium. And it's not as though there's nothing growing down here. It's just that down here, there are also great benefits to maritime trade. Maybe less so over here because you don't have as many of those natural harbors, but you do have the Po Valley and land-based trade that can go here, which is great, again, for more agricultural-oriented cities. You've got natural defense in the Alpine mountains, and where one or more of these features are especially prominent, you can have some pretty impressive cities. Rome, for example, is in a fertile agricultural region. Rome benefits from being right on the river, and therefore it has access to the ocean and trade as well. So Rome would be a fantastic spot to found a civilization when we're talking about an already great place to found civilizations in Italy more broadly. So let's look at how this thing kind of went and look at a rough timeline of the settlement of Italy. And again, Rome does not come into the picture until very late in this timeline, but you can see the kinds of forces that are behind the growth of civilization in Italy, and these are the same forces that lead to the growth of Rome. I want to start out with around 4000 BC, because this is when we see the first evidence of agriculture in Italy, primarily in the Po Valley, but also down into Etruria and Latium on the central west coast. Settled agriculture enables people to be non-nomadic, or to be at best semi-nomadic. That is, they no longer have to wander around and forage for food or steal food from other people. They can create more permanent dwellings. They can mix their labor with the land, invest in it, improve it. And indeed, we see around this time a flourishing of pottery and ceramics with this square shape. And these are kind of standardized in the Po Valley in particular, which of course is the most fertile agricultural region. The Po Valley is also home to a variety of different livestock by 4000 BC. So sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. Now, in the hills of Italy, goats and sheep are far more common. We don't see as much cattle, but in the flatter areas like the Po Valley, cattle are far more prominent. Now, especially in the agricultural regions of Italy, trade is not prominent at this time. In fact, most of these very small settlements, which are largely based around families and clans, so extended families at most, and these are small settlements of, less than 100 people, there is really not much trade happening, apart from highly localized trade between neighboring settlements. These are largely autarkic settlements. That is, they consume what they produce and do not rely on trade for much, if any, of their consumption. This situation begins to change pretty dramatically by the Bronze Age. Now, the Bronze Age is a huge period. It really goes from about 3200 BC to around 1200 BC. But right in the middle of that is the peak. You have the early Bronze Age, the middle Bronze Age, and the late Bronze Age happening around the 1200s. Now, different parts of Italy experience the Bronze Age in different ways. It is not as though when 3200 hits, suddenly all the stone tools are thrown away and everybody uses bronze. It doesn't work that way. In fact, there are stone tools being used in Italy for thousands of years into the Bronze Age, and indeed even into the Iron Age when we get to about the 800s BC. And bronze will continue to be used into that period as well. But what distinguishes the Bronze Age are a few things. Obviously bronze, that is, these agricultural settlements become wealthy enough to support people who do not need to actually participate in labor in the fields. They can instead mine metal. They can experiment with manufacturing different alloys and working those alloys into usable tools that in fact are much better than the stone and wood tools and bone tools that are being used. It shouldn't be surprising that bronze hits the Po Valley first. Bronze, of course, is an alloy of copper and tin. To this day, archaeologists are finding things like scythes and axes and spearheads in the Po Valley, and indeed further into southern Italy. In fact, the Po Valley becomes so prosperous that by the 1800s or so BC, right at the height of the Bronze Age, there are settlements of over 100 people. In fact, some of them are around 10 hectares large, and they are polka dotted across the Po Valley, only about 5 to 6 kilometers apart. In other words, within walking distance. What that suggests is these Bronze Age settlements in the Po Valley are beginning to trade with one another. They are likely dealing in pottery, fabrics, wooden items, antlered items, and of course, bronze tools and weapons. Many of the bronze tools and weapons that survive in tombs. And what that also tells us is that the wealth that was appearing in the Italian Bronze Age was being concentrated in particular strata of society. In other words, an elite was emerging in the Po Valley and in other parts of Italy. So we have social and economic stratification, in addition to a growing urbanization. Now, around 1200, something awful happens in the Mediterranean. We still don't know exactly what it was, and it may have been many things. But that region of the world enters a kind of declining period, and then it's not until around the 800s BC that we see the reemergence of sustained growth. And this is the annunciation of the Iron Age. In the northern part of Italy, we see the rise of what is called the Villanovan culture. This occurs mostly in Etruria, in western central Italy. Now, the Villanovan culture is quite mysterious. It seems to be Celtic. It seems to be native to Italy. In other words, these are not people that moved to Italy, but seem to be, based on genetic evidence from burials, indigenous to Italy. However, they have some things that suggest they had quite a bit of contact with the outside world. In particular, they have writing. So around the 800s BC, we see the development of some of the earliest Italian scripts. One of them is seen, for example, on the Duenos inscription found on this ceramic object in Rome, dating from around 800 to as late as 550 BC. The text moves right to left, so you would read it and it goes around the pots like this. Nobody knows exactly what it says. The characters are a mixture of kind of Greek-looking. They also look a little bit like some Latin characters, and then there's some stuff in there that just doesn't really make any sense at all. And what's probably happening is these cultures in northern Italy are engaging with other cultures that have brought writing to them, and they're creating their own writing system. And at the same time that writing is emerging, larger and larger settlements, almost proto-urban settlements, larger gatherings of multiple different families and clans. This is occurring in the Po Valley, but also in Etruria and Latium. These people seem to have a unifying culture. That is, some of these gathering places are made out of stone. That is, they're meant to be permanent. They accommodate festivals and marketplaces where people in a variety of nearby settlements can trade and share cultural exchange. As a result, they begin to speak a similar language. and we have the emergence of a Latin culture in Latium. These people are finding hills and building earthworks in those hills, that is, ditches and defensible banks. And then we see another leap forward when we're getting into the period between 800 and 500 BC. This is called the Archaic period, where we begin to see these larger proto-urban settlements developing into full-blown cities, and these at a variety of parts of the Italian peninsula. Some in the north appear to be more domestic, that is, they are built on the basis of agriculture by the people that live there. In the south, we see many of these settlements forming around maritime trade and around the coastlines of Italy. There are two cultures that seem to be influencing the development of these cities in the south. One, the Greeks, who are setting up colonies that are sent from Greek cities like Athens and Sparta and other famous cities in Greece. Just surplus population is getting onto ships. They are sailing to the west, landing in the south of Italy, and engaging in trade and making a lot of wealth in doing that. The other culture responsible for cities in the south of Italy and on Sicily are the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians come from even further away. They come from the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, and they spread their culture even further than Italy. The city of Carthage, for example, in North Africa, is a Phoenician city. They found cities on the southern coast of Spain and in Sicily. And the Phoenicians are bringing even more exotic goods to the Italian peninsula. Now, although these cities are different and have different cultural influences that brought them about, they are in effect the same kind of thing, city-states. And for what a city-state is, you will have to tune in to the next lecture. You should now have a great sense of how Italy was a great spot for civilization to flourish. We haven't zoomed into Rome itself yet, but you can see the canvas for what it is. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll check out the next video. Thanks a bunch for watching. Thanks so much for checking out this video. I very much hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did, please like the video or leave a comment, or even better, subscribe to the channel. All of these things boost the channel tremendously in the YouTube algorithm. I also hope that you'll consider checking out my podcast, the Pax Romana Podcast. It uploads to YouTube, but it's also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and just about anywhere else you can get podcasts. Finally, if you want to, you can follow me on X. Just look up at Prof, CPE, at PROFCPE, and you can find me there. And of course, I'll continue to upload YouTube videos about once a week. Hope you enjoy. Thanks a bunch. We'll see you next time.